Well, what amount of evidence can justify the claims of miracles? What is a miracle? What is justification anyway? I have two guests with me that differ on their answers to those questions, and we will listen in to their conversation. Hello, doubters. If you are questioning your Christian faith, you are in the right place. I'm doing something a little bit different in this video. I have atheist Benjaman Watkins from Real Anthology channel and David Pallman from the Christian Evidentialism channel. David has been on my show a few times before, so I'm excited to have both of them discuss this topic. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Well, I think we need to start with, Benjaman, again, it was funny because Benjaman and I were talking about this, so he's got these two names, so I might call him Blake, I might call him Ben, just because I was used to calling him Blake at first, but we've, just transitioned because his name's on the screen. So let's go ahead and just start with some definitions, and we'll kind of, as we do that, kind of unpack who you guys are and what you do on your channels, but I think it's kind of just great to just jump into this conversation and get things rolling. So I think we need to start by defining miracles. If we're going to answer any of these questions, we need to understand what is a miracle first and kind of get to the bottom of that. So, Ben, why don't we start with you? How would you define the word miracle? What is a miracle?
Yeah, so I understand miracles as deviations from the usual course of the laws of nature that do not occur unless a supernatural power intervenes. So I follow the philosopher J.L. Mackie. I think his definition is a very useful one. He says that the laws of nature describe the ways in which the world works when left to itself, when not interfered with. A miracle occurs when the world is not left to itself, when something distinct from the natural order as a whole intrudes into it. And so I think that concept at least allows us to have a working concept of what we mean by miracle.
Okay, and that's a good start. David, would you redefine it, or would you take issue with anything that was in that definition there?
Yeah, as will become evident, I'm not a big fan of defining miracles in terms of the laws of nature because I don't think that's helpful. The definition that I would propose would just be a miracle is an event that would not have happened if only the natural order had been operating.
Okay, so help me understand, guys. So what's the difference between those two? It sounds, David, that sounds similar to what Ben said. So help unpack that. David, where do you see the major difference between your definition and his definition?
Yeah, so what's looming in the background here is the argument that we're going to be discussing, which is David Hume's famous argument against the possibility of justified belief in miracles. And a lot of it hinges, in my opinion, on how Hume defines miracles as being violations of the laws of nature. And so what we're going to see is that for Hume, there's this competition between the evidence in favor of a law of nature and the evidence in favor of a miracle. And so he wants to put those two evidence for each of those in competition with each other and say, well, which is stronger? Clearly the evidence for a law of nature. And so that's kind of why I'm motivated to try to define miracles without recourse to the laws of nature, because I want to keep the two conceptually distinct, because I don't want the evidence for the two of them to come in competition with each other.
So Ben, how would you respond to that? What is that a fair critique? Is there something missing there?
Well, so I think I'm more inclined to your original intuition, Tim, in that I don't think there's a whole lot of disagreement in our discussion in how we are conceptualizing a miracle. Where we disagree is on how should we cash out the concept or the differences between the laws of nature, and I believe he used the term the natural order. But we both agree that it's how the uniform experience that we have, the necessary patterns of connections between things like cause and effect. And so that if left to itself without the intervention of a divine will, some set of cause and effects will follow. But if the divine will, assuming an agent acts on this natural order as a whole, then they can have different causal effects than would have followed from the natural order, right, David? That's you'd say it in terms like that.
I think, yeah, at least when we're speaking epistemologically about identifying a miracle, then it's important that a miracle have specific properties which exceed, the capabilities of, say, natural agents or natural objects or their interactions with each other. So those sorts of things. If those are sufficient to explain an event, then we're not going to be likely to attribute it to a divine agent. So, yes, it's important that it be the sort of event that can't be explained by the causal powers of sort of the world that we're familiar with.
Okay. I think that's Ben. Did you want to come back on that?
I don't think I really have a whole lot to disagree with there. I would want to cash out the concept of miracles further as well, in the sense of kind of what David was alluding to here, in the sense that there's going to be certain properties of miracles that, they're going to function as like religious signs. So miracles are going, a divine will is going to use miracles to convey some sort of message to us.
Okay.
And so that I think is a necessary feature of a miracle that is what makes it a religiously important idea. This idea that, there is a divine will that cares about us so much, in fact, that they're willing to intrude on the natural world on our behalf. I think that's a feature of a miracle of it, because if we were to say that, God performed a miracle somewhere on Saturn, well, is that really of any kind of religious significance? Yeah, that might be something super unlikely, but it's, even if we were to establish it, it's not clear that that would be of any sort of religious significance. But if God chose to resurrect his son for the sins of mankind, all of a sudden that is something with a religious significance, something that draws our attention to it in religiously appropriate ways.
David, what are your thoughts on that comment?
I agree with it when we're, again, epistemologically trying to determine if an event is a miracle, then I think the context of it becomes important. And so, specifically, if there's some sort of religious context in which the miracle occurs, then we can begin considering the possibility of miracle more likely as opposed to just an anomaly. I would be careful I wouldn't want to say that like a miracle has to function as a sign. It seems like if God, did just create, something on Saturn, while it might be useless to us, it still seems like that's something that should be, considered in a miracle. So if we're kind of looking at criteria for a miracle versus criteria for identifying a miracle, then I'm not sure in the criteria of a miracle it has to function as a divine sign, but certainly when we're trying to identify an event as a miracle, it becomes important. So maybe that's just a distinction that only philosophers would care about, but it is one I would make.
Well, let's be honest. Probably
Just fair.
most of this stuff is things that only philosophers would care about. But
That's fair.
David, you bring up a good point, though. One of the reasons that I thought this conversation would be interesting is because on my channel and my community in the Dealing with Deconstruction Facebook group, hi to all of our Facebook group people that are checking this out in our Facebook group. So one of the things that I talk about is we have to understand and know in our deconstruction process the idea of how do we know what is true. And so I think this is a really important discussion for that matter. And then I think the second question that we often look at is maybe not in chronological order, but did Jesus walk out of the grave? And that is literally impossible if we can't know or can't even demonstrate miracles. So that's why I think this conversation is really important. I think these two perspectives are really interesting to kind of consider as we're looking at some of this. So that's kind of why we're talking about this, why I thought it'd be great to have these guys on, and they're friends of mine, and we interact on several different topics. So I think it would be good to move on to kind of the next question for both of you. And David, I'm going to have you start here. How would each of you define justification / evidence? So, David, if you had to kind of lay that out, how would you define what is going to justify or what my evidence might be?
Sure. Very broadly, justification in epistemology just refers to having some sort of reason for believing what you do. And it's specifically supposed to be a truth indicative reason. So it's not just having like a motivating reason, like I believe this because I want to. It's having a what would be called an epistemic reason, and that's the sort of reason that's appropriate for holding this belief, in the sense that it makes the belief likely to be true. And so I'm an evidentialist. So for me, justification just is evidence. And so evidence I would define as being that which either increases or decreases the likelihood of the truth of a proposition. Or maybe just put more simply, we could say it's that which either guarantees or makes more likely the truth of some proposition.
Okay, so I think that's a good start. I might have some follow-up questions, but I would love to hear, Ben, how would you define evidence and justification? And then we'll kind of discuss some of the differences there, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, so I'm not going to disagree with a whole lot of what David just said there about the concept of justification. I think he's more or less right in what he says about the concept of justification. The only thing that I would add to this is to cash out. So he said, more likely to be true than not, this idea of likelihood. So I think that essential to any concept of evidence is going to be the principles of probability. And so to give an example of one is the law of likelihood that says some observation is evidence for hypothesis H1 rather than hypothesis H2 if and only if the probability of observation H1 is greater than the probability of observation H2. So that's an uncontroversial principle, a priori principle of probability. And so I think that is going to be essential to our concept of evidence, as well as the concept of a reason. David also mentioned that. So I'm what's called a normative realist. I'm a realist about reasons. And so I think that there are what are called epistemic reasons to have certain beliefs. For example, the fact that some argument is valid and the fact that it has true premises gives us a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And so I think this concept of this normative concept of reason and this probabilistic concept of the law of likelihood, I think these are both essential to the concept of evidence.
Okay. Again, if the audience is trying to do their best to follow, again, we're wading in deep here. That's totally fine. I love it. Ben, I think it would be helpful as we kind of revisit the evidence justification kind of discussion, maybe for you to lay out what Hume's objection was. David kind of referred to it earlier just a little bit, but maybe you could kind of just lay out briefly why Hume had a problem with justifying miracles or evidence that would, demonstrate that a miracle is true. And then we'll kind of come back to this evidence justification question. So just lay out Hume's issue for us.
Yeah, so Hume was trying to find a necessary condition for believing miracle testimony as true and establishing a miracle. So we have to keep in mind that Hume is writing in a time when there are no pictures because there's no cameras, there's no video cameras. So when you find out about events in the world, you find out about them from talking to other people. And so he's observing testimony, and he's asking, okay, well, what are the necessary conditions that some testimony must meet in order for us to rationally believe that a miracle occurred? And so that's his way of framing it. And so there's what J.H. Sobel has called Hume's theorem. And so Hume's theorem roughly goes, testimony is insufficient to justify a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. And so if we understand this concept as more miraculous, and we understand, the testimony in favor of a miracle as evidence for that miracle, then we can straightforwardly deduce Hume's theorem from the basic principles of probability, often called the Kolmogorov principles, and the definition of conditional probability. So it's in a way uncontroversial. But what's more controversial is what implications this probabilistic theorem has for rationality of belief in miracles. And so what Hume says is that a necessary condition for us to believe that a miracle has occurred is that the prior probability of whatever the miracle is has to be greater than the probability of the false testimony that we have. And so Hume's skepticism, when he looks out into the world, he uses roughly two tests. He looks at the prior probability of miracles, and he sees that they're very, very low. And then he looks at the probability of false testimony for miracles of a religious nature, and he sees that that's a very, very high probability. And so that necessary condition for the probability that a miracle happened given some testimony just doesn't meet the necessary conditions necessary for that to be justified. And so that's his skepticism. He sees that his theorem, what we were calling Hume's theorem, presents this necessary condition. And that when we observe the evidence that we have, the testimony evidence we have, the probability that that testimony is false is far greater than the prior probability of the miracle that it endeavors to establish. And because that's the case, and that necessary condition is likely never going to be met, we're not rationally justified in believing a miracle. And so he sees that if we were to believe in a miracle, especially one of a religious nature, the testimony that would be required to justify such an extraordinary claim would look something more like a controlled science experiment, like something at CERN, instead of a survey of historical documents. The methods that we have available, the historical methods, are just not going to be sufficient to establish something like a miracle. And so I think this also explains why contemporary historians, aren't so keen on trying to explain as part of their historical theses that a miracle occurred, because they realize that their methods of coming to such conclusions just aren't robust enough.
Well, I think
extraordinary enough to use Hume's terms.
No, you did an excellent job of kind of summarizing that and kind of pulling several different pieces together. So fantastic. You can tell that you're kind of in the middle of a deep research project on this. So you did a great job. So, David, I would like for you to respond. I have several things that are just kind of rolling around in my head, questions that I might have that we can follow up with here. But David, how would you respond to to what Ben just laid out there? Just lay it out for us. How would you answer some of that?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, he gave a pretty good summary of the argument, right? It pretty much Hume takes miracles to be violations of natural law, and Hume asks us to consider the strong inductive evidence for believing in laws of nature and compare that to the weaker testimonial evidence that we possess for any given miracle claim. And Hume takes it to be clear that the testimonial evidence is just never going to outweigh the inductive evidence for the laws of nature. So the greater evidence is always going to support laws of nature over and against the miraculous. So like I said, the strategy there is to put the evidence for the laws of nature in competition with the evidence for miracles. Now, if you're like me, you're a Christian theist, it should seem evident to you that something's kind of gone wrong here, because I want to affirm both that there are laws of nature and that miracles occur. So kind of how did these propositions come in conflict with one another? It's sort of like if I wanted to say, well, we got to weigh the evidence for atheism and the evidence for evolution, and well, it looks like we got stronger evidence for evolution, so atheism has to go. The atheist is probably going to be scratching their head like, wait, what happened there? But then kind of we have to ask the question, so what exactly went wrong with Hume's argument? How did he manage to put the laws of nature in a competition with miracles? And I think that the answer is basically in Hume's definition. He's defined miracles as violations of the laws of nature. So kind of the way I respond to Hume is twofold. And Ben, I apologize, this doesn't perfectly map onto your sort of interpretation of Hume, so we can go wherever you want. But I think that this is kind of, when you're discussing how Hume is kind of arriving at this low prior on miracles, I think it's due to this issue. So I think there is relevance there. But first, I think it's false, or at least unclear, that a law of nature could be violated. It's unfortunately for kind of those who are maybe curious of what is a law of nature, there's not really a single accepted answer to that question. But fortunately, I think my point holds on just about any account of laws of nature. Observe that laws are inherently propositional, and propositions can be prescriptive or descriptive. But it makes little sense to regard the laws of nature as prescriptive, for laws have no causal powers in and of themselves. Apart from, unless we want to say like apart from theism, then maybe God is sort of like enforcing laws of nature. But I certainly don't think the naturalist wants to go that route. So it seems like laws of nature have to be descriptive. But descriptions can't be violated. They can fail to describe certain things, but in that case, every law of nature is going to fail to describe some things. And by the way, notice that holds even if the phenomenon in question could nevertheless be described by another law of nature. But again, no one wants to say that this means that laws of nature are being violated just because they don't describe everything. So I think it's probably false that it even makes sense to speak of the laws of nature as being violated. And so as that relates to miracles, I propose that if they occur, they're just in a category of events which are not described by natural laws. They're events upon which the laws of nature are silent. So, that's kind of where my issue goes with Hume when he's trying to show that there's sort of this overwhelming prior evidence that we have against miracles. I just don't think we have that, because I don't think that the evidence in favor of the laws of nature is evidence against the miraculous. And so we'll see where Ben wants to take it from there.
Yeah, Ben, I mean, again, feel free. I don't need to necessarily mediate the entire conversation. Feel free to respond to whatever, and you guys can have a back and forth here.
Yeah, so I would want to just kind of sidestep that whole disagreement, because what I think is the relevant thing to be considering is the prior probability of a miracle. And so we can say, you can say, oh, well, I don't really want to pit the laws of nature against the concept of a miracle. Well, that still leaves the question open of like, well, what is the prior probability of a miracle? And so I think we can, without even mentioning the laws of nature, we can say that the prior probability of a miracle must be low. And so what Robert Fogelin has called the reverse test, he sees Hume as trying to answer this question in part one of his essay of miracles, of what is the prior probability of a miracle. And so the first reason why we could think that the prior probability of a miracle is low comes from J.H. Sobel. And he says that miracles in general would all be immediate realizations in material things of the wills and intentions of invisible and so bodiless agents. Contrary, our exceptionalist experience of agents, wills, and intentions operating only by way of their bodies. And so, second, turning to the resurrection specifically, all of us have a uniform experience of people staying dead. So the prior probability that anyone who died will also stay dead is extremely high. Finally, the resurrection is a complex hypothesis that makes claims about a divine psychology. The first and this last reason help us see the prior probability of the resurrection must be extremely low, because it's the product of two extremely small probabilities. The first being the probability that at least one miracle has occurred, and the second being the probability God specifically wanted to bring about a resurrection when, where, and of who he did. The results of Hume's reverse test leave miracles generally, and the resurrection in particular, with extremely low prior probabilities. And I don't think I have to say a whole lot about the laws of nature, except, that our uniform experience of reality counts in favor of either a miracle or it counts in favor of a law of nature. And I think our uniform experience obviously favors the law of nature more than the miracle. Now, you can quibble about the concept of miracle and law of nature and try to define it however you want, but I think that the fact that we have a uniform experience of certain causes and effects and necessary patterns that we observe in the world, that observation, given the law of likelihood that I mentioned earlier, is more likely given exceptionalist laws of nature, or that there are laws of nature, necessary patterns that aren't intruded on by the supernatural, then they do support a miracle claim. And that claim is all we need to get miracles have a low prior probability.
Yeah, I guess I'll make 2 points in way of kind of a response to that. So, on the one hand, it doesn't seem to me that kind of the issue of the prior probability of miracles is really that big of a deal, as long as we're going to say that it's not zero. If it's a non zero probability, then any non zero probability can be overcome by sufficient evidence. And so, as long as the prior probability of a miracle happening is not zero, that is, it's not logically impossible, that is, miracles don't entail a logical contradiction, and I don't think you're saying that they do, then in principle they could be justified by sufficient evidence, right? And remember, we are discussing here, I think, whether they can be justified and not so much whether one actually has been justified. But perhaps more to your point about well, maybe I'll just ask this point as a question. So when you say all of our experience supports there being no exceptions to natural regularities, um, I think that might risk begging the question. That is, if you're trying to apply that universally, because that seems to assume that the testimony of all people who at least claim to experience miracles is false. I think you could avoid that by saying that all of your experience supports there being no exceptions to natural regularities, but that seems like a considerably weaker claim. So maybe you could clarify what you mean when you say all of our experience.
So all I'm getting there at is so when we ask what is the prior probability of a miracle, well, we can ask the question, what is the probability that the next person who dies will stay dead? You and I would both agree that that prior probability is very high. And so the probability that they will rise from the dead, that possibility, there's a range between 0 and 1 in which this, those are the bounds of the probability calculus here. And so we both agree that the prior probability that a dead man would come back to life is very low from our experience. That's what we get from experience. That's like when we go out in the world and we observe the world, we observe dead people staying dead, such that the next dead person we meet will probably, before considering any evidence, will probably stay dead. That has a high probability. And so the prior probability of the miracle event must be 1 minus this high prior probability.
Sure, as long as we're not saying it's zero, I'm fine with that.
So I'll concede to you the possibility of miracles. So Spinoza famously tried to rule out miracles by definition. Laws of nature, exceptionalist regularities. A miracle would be an exception to the regularity, and so that's not possible. And so basically, makes a miracle almost a contradiction in terms with the laws of nature. I'm not doing that, and I don't think Hume is either. But so you said the interesting claim that grabbed my attention was, I don't think that the prior probability is a big deal. Well, according to Hume's theorem, it is a big deal because it's part of a necessary condition for the rationality of a belief in a miracle. And that's that the prior probability of whatever the miracle testimony is trying to establish, that prior probability has to be greater than the probability that the testimony we've observed in favor of the miracle is false. If the falsehood of that miracle testimony is more miraculous than a resurrection, then we've met the necessary. I'm not saying it's a sufficient condition, but that it must be the case. You're saying, look, resurrection is probable given this set of testimonial evidence. A necessary condition of that is that the falsehood of that testimony condition is more miraculous than a resurrection. And so we've both agreed that a resurrection has a low prior probability. And I want to argue that a false religious claim of a miracle has a high probability.
Yeah, so I mean, terminological concern here. I don't like this language of more miraculous. So, like, miracles are a
More
Bible
probable.
category. Yeah, they're a
Yeah, I'll
Bible
use
category such that either an event is a miracle or it's not. So I don't like
yeah.
this
So
like
when I say
language of this
more
has to be more
miraculous, I mean
miraculous.
more probable.
Yeah, I know you did. I just wanted
Yeah.
to be clear on that point. So yeah, not to not to try to win points on an easy thing, but no, yeah. So maybe I think I was probably a little careless before when I said that it's not a big deal. I think yeah, it'll become important when you're actually comparing if we want to say what the prior probability is versus the evidence in favor of a miracle. What I meant is I don't think it's important to the point of could a miracle in principle be justified if we're going to say that the prior probability is not zero, because again, any non-zero prior probability can be overcome by sufficient evidence. So, I mean, we can talk about whether we have sufficient evidence. That's a different conversation about if we're like actually going to debate the resurrection of Jesus. Then we're debating, do we have sufficient evidence to believe in a resurrection claim? But that doesn't seem to me to be Hume's argument. Arguably, it is in part two of his essay. But in part one of the essay, at least he's using very strong language there. It sounds like he's saying just based on the evidence for the laws of nature alone, we can already say, yeah, a miracle is just never going to be able to overcome that evidence. And so that's, at least for me, why I think it kind of does go back to that issue of laws of nature.
So Blake, would you
So
agree with that? Would you agree that if the prior
not
probability is
that
not
reading of Hume.
zero, yeah.
Yeah, so in the first part of Hume's of miracles, I see him as showcasing Hume's theorem, so laying out Hume's theorem, and then providing us with the two tests: one to evaluate the prior probability of the miracle, and the other test to evaluate the probability of the false miracle testimony. And so he sees that as is not ruling out miracles a priori, but saying like, look, this is the framework. This is what's providing the drive for skepticism is the Hume's theorem. And so he leaves it to the reader at the end of part one to use those tests to directly test testimony. He thinks it's obvious that the probability that religious miracle claims could be false testimony, that's high. He thinks that's obvious. And he also thinks that it's obvious that the prior probability of a miracle is low. And that's where the laws of nature come into play, because he says, look, dead people stay dead. That's part of the law of nature. And so if you have the prior probability of a miracle is low, and you have that the probability of the false miracle testimony is high, and a necessary condition is that the prior probability must be greater than this probability, well, then that means that the miracle, like believing the miracle claim, isn't rational. That necessary condition isn't met. Part two of Hume's of miracles, he lays out the actual empirical evidence. He said, he lays out reasons. He says, look, he uses rather colorful language too. He says, miracle claims are abundant in barbarous nations and things that would be totally un-PC to say nowadays.
Wow, he'd be canceled. Totally canceled.
Yeah, he'd be canceled. Yeah. Well, so he was in Edinburgh recently at the University of Edinburgh, canceled David Hume, which to me is wild. He's like the greatest philosopher to write in English, and he's from Scotland. So
I think that's interesting. So let me ask another question, and this might take us in a different direction, and I'm okay with that if you guys are okay with that. So I think how would I evaluate whether or not a miracle happened to me? Because that wouldn't necessarily be testimony. So I grant that there would be a difference between what I could justify to David and Ben, but what about a justification to yourself? If you witnessed, let's just say, if you witnessed a true miracle, are there different criteria that you would be able to use based on I'm justifying this for myself, and I think that's valid, but I may not be able to justify it to you? So, David, talk to me a little bit about that, and then Ben, I want you to respond. So David, kick us off there.
So we're discussing the sort of the criteria. So if we establish that, then you could, in principle, have a justified belief in the possibility of miracles. Then, yeah, I think what you're asking here is kind of the next question. Then, okay, so then, sort of, what are the conditions then under which a belief in the miraculous could be justified? A man by the name of, and I'm forgetting his first name. I know his last name is Douglas, but he has a book called The Criteria, where he lays out several different criteria of things that you would need for a justified belief in a miracle. And so these are things sort of like that miracle claim shouldn't be benefiting the people who are making them, or at any rate, you've got some reason to be skeptical if a person who is telling you a miracle happened is actively benefiting from that. They shouldn't be like crazy late after the events that that they're describing. Like, you shouldn't be getting the reports like 300 years after it's supposed to have happened. It's a little bit late. And so Douglas goes through a lot of those sorts of things and says, so kind of here are some things that, it works as like a filter to sort of sort out, or adjudicate which miracle claims are worth investigating and which ones are not. But I mean, ultimately, it's just going to come down to it's kind of hard to put like precise numbers on matters of testimony. So ultimately, you have to check your witnesses, right? Check the people who are bearing this testimony and just run it through tests of reliability. So I mean. We use these in courts, right? That if you've got multiple witnesses, then that's going to raise the probability that whatever is being reported actually happened. If maybe you've got embarrassing testimony, maybe you've got testimony that is preferably closer to the events by somebody who actually saw it and is not getting it secondhand. These sorts of considerations, I think, are just generally applied to testimony in general. And so in the case of a miracle, if we're going to say that one can happen, then we can just apply them to a miracle, testimony to miracles rather, as well.
Ben, how would you respond?
Yeah, so there's a very famous passage from Hume that I think would set the stage nicely here. He says, when anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other. According to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. So what I think Hume is trying to tell us here is that when we receive testimony of a miracle, we can ask ourselves a question: what's more likely, that this miracle occurred or that the testimony was deceived or would deceive? And so that it's almost always going to be the case that it's more likely that it was deceived or would deceive. So I think when we turn now to this immediate first person experience of a miracle, so let's say that you're not getting this from testimony, you're getting this from your own direct experience. So I think you have to shift the question appropriately. So instead of asking what's more likely, that a miracle occurred or that I was deceived or would be deceived, or instead ask what's more likely, that a miracle occurred or that I'm under some misapprehension. And so it might be the case that it's going to be more probable that you're under some sort of misapprehension. But then if, say, miracle experience continued to persist, and all of a sudden that defeater is going to become less and less cogent as this experience is sustained. And so I think there are ways to, in principle, come to a rational belief of an immediate miracle if it was happening in front of you. I think that's why most people say, like, what would change their mind? Well, if a miracle happened in front of me, if you were able to sustain that experience, it's very possible that you could rationally come to believe in a miracle. And so when people I'm asked often as an atheist, what sort of evidence would change your mind? And I always say a religious experience. Like if miracles were happening and in front of me, I would change my mind. Because eventually that Humean skepticism is going to hit a wall in which you're going to say, no, this is reality. I'm experiencing it right here in front of me.
So if that happened, if a miracle happened in front of you or to you, let's say, but then how would you justify that for somebody to somebody else? Like, would it raise your prior probability so much so that you would like, okay, I'm going to accept that, but then would you then reevaluate other miracle claims that you had heard in the past? Maybe again, maybe not even the Jesus one.
I would then become the person giving the testimony, and so they would have a Humean skepticism towards me. So yeah, you're right. It's a very, it'd be a really infuriating situation to imagine for myself. Like, dude, I had this experience. I know it's so wild that you can't even believe it, but like, I don't know how else to rationally persuade you of it other than to say, come experience it for yourself. I think that would be the best I could do epistemically. David might have some better thoughts about these thoughts. His epistemology, I'll be honest, is more his wheelhouse. So
Yeah,
I'll submit to his wisdom.
I was just going to say that it seems awful strange that if you can accept, testimony about other events, it's odd that, if your epistemology would say, oh, but it's inadmissible when it comes to this category of event. It seems like something's wrong with your epistemology if you don't really have a way of, or specifically something's wrong with your epistemology of testimony if you can't gain knowledge of actual events by testimony or of a particular type. Then that it seems that there's an issue with sort of one's methodology there. But that was a thought that I had while Ben was talking about that.
That's fair.
Well, yeah, and I guess one of the things that's interesting is there is this category, and I think, Ben, you've kind of described this already, that it's you have a non-zero probability, which means that it's at least possible on some level. It's not a logical contradiction in the idea of miracles. So then wouldn't you then go to specific instances? And so I'm just trying to probe at what this is, but wouldn't the proper evaluation, and maybe, David, you could lay this out maybe a little bit better than I could, would be then to say, what evidence do we have? And is it reasonable to expect that we have any evidence at all if it didn't happen? Does that make sense? Like, so again, so far I want to like avoid the Jesus question for right now. Briefly, I have a really good friend of mine. He was a ministry leader of mine several years ago. Dude had like pretty severe cancer. His time of hey, you only have about 8 months to live is kind of what happened. I'll save the full details of the story. But within 3 months, it was like right before we moved down to North Carolina, within 3 months when he went back to get his scan, it was all gone. And the language that the oncologist used was that it was miraculous, right? He's like, I can't explain this. This is, nothing short of a miracle, right? And he's been clean for the last 5 years ever since then. Now, I didn't experience that myself, but I have every reason to believe that what he's saying is true, right? But then I also have videos of him and his wife sitting in the oncologist's office with the scans and them looking at it being like, yeah, I have no explanation for this. There's no medical explanation that I can come up with. Never seen this before in my practice. So the existence of a clean scan to me seems more likely that he was healed miraculously than not, if that makes sense, right? Like, there wouldn't be a clean scan if he wasn't healed miraculously.
Well, so Hume kind of touches on this a little bit as well. Another famous passage from Hume is that it is no miracle that a man seemingly in good health should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death has been frequently observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must therefore be uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit that appellation. And so what he's saying is that, look, we observe in medicine people that heal in medical anomalies like you described.
Yeah.
And so it's not so clear based on Hume's understanding of a miracle that such an event would be a miracle, but that there would be a miracle if a dead person would arise, because it's not seen in any other age or across any other country. But we do see in medicine across the world and across time, people mysteriously getting better from illnesses that seemed terminal at one point. And so it's not clear if that is one of, it warrants the title, the appellation is the word Hume used, the appellation of the title miracle. A miracle's got to be, on this much grander scale, this idea of, a violation of the laws of nature, not just a really, really implausible event, like a spontaneous healing of some sort of illness, because it's not clear that such a thing violates the laws of nature or deviates from the laws of nature or requires a supernatural will to intervene in order to do that.
And
David,
is,
how
is
would you
that is
respond?
that Hume is that Hume's distinction between miracle and marvel? Would you say, Ben?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. So Hume would describe, someone getting healed mysteriously, a marvelous thing to observe. But is it a miraculous thing to observe? It's not so clear that it is, but maybe it has the other sort of significant properties. And I remember how I mentioned earlier, like how a miracle might function as a sign. Well, I think it's really easy to see a sign in something like a spontaneous healing. That does, that scene, if you were to say, oh, well, there's a being that cares about you in the world, and they intervene in the world on your behalf, it's natural to see that in the marvelous.
Okay.
Sweet. Okay, I mean, again, we can wrap it up. Is there any other subjects that you guys want to cover? Any past details of things that we missed that you want to come back to before we wrap up this conversation? It's been a fantastic conversation. I don't want to cut it off early if there's more to say.
I wanted to ask Ben one thing about, and this might actually end us on a positive note, unless he wants to follow up. But
Are
so
we on a negative note? What? When did that happen?
no, that's a fair point.
We're
So
we're we're actually on this note right here,
Right
right now.
here.
We
Okay.
we want to end. We want to end
middle,
on this. See, we want to resolve. Yeah, okay. Sorry, David. Go ahead.
you're good. So yeah, no. Kind of in recent literature on Hume, there's been kind of three recent major defenses of him, but in particular two that I know that you've read and spoken positively of, and these would be Robert Fogelin and Alexander George, I believe is the other one.
George. Yes.
Yeah. So now I've read both of them, and based on what I've seen you argue in the past, and kind of even on my page the other day, it seemed to me that you are very favorable towards George's approach, sort of George's interpretation of Hume, and that's kind of what my opening looked a little bit the way it did because I thought that's the direction this was going to go. I have considerably more agreement with Fogel, and not with respect to his interpretation of Hume. I think his interpretation of Hume is incorrect, but I would recognize he's got an independent argument either way that is worthy of discussion. But I'm more sympathetic to kind of Fogelin's approach there because he does seem to allow, you could have a justified belief in miracles. It's just we don't have sufficient empirical evidence there, and that's a different conversation. That seems very different to me than the sort of argument that George makes, where he really does seem to want to go the full Humean route that we've got. This really strong evidence for the laws of nature, and that is in turn evidence against miracles. So, do you not see those two as being in tension? And if so, then do you disagree with George on that point?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So actually my readings for Hume that have influenced me the most here come from Sobel in Logic and Theism. And so that's kind of my core understanding and how I read Hume. And so I see other commentators as kind of, chipping away at that kind of core understanding. And so I don't see a whole lot of real substantive disagreement between Fogelin and George on how, so um, Fogelin lays out an argument with two premises and a conclusion, and George lays out two premises and a conclusion, but he calls it a first lemma and a second lemma because he calls the whole thing Hume's theorem. Um, but I see the content of those arguments as almost identical. And so the approach that I think is right for Hume is to see his first part as expositioning his theorem, Hume's theorem, or what's sometimes called Hume's law, and then giving us the methods for evaluating that. And then in the second part, laying out empirical evidence for him. And so, as far as I understand, Vogelin and George both, they have that reading. They both have that reading of Hume as well. And so they see other commentators as kind of making a mistake if they try to see either part of the essays stand alone on their own, or try to reach conclusions on their own. They have to be taken together. That's an essential feature of the reading of Hume that I think they both get right. So everything else is kind of minor quibbling in my mind.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. Because as it comes to part one of Hume's essay, I understood George and Vogelin. Like, I read them significantly differently there. And again, that could be a flaw on my part as well. But that's interesting to me, because when you started, what you seemed in this conversation to me is you seem to follow after Vogelin a lot more. And again, I have a lot more sympathy with Vogelin's approach than, at least as I've read George, than I have.
He's a better writer, in my opinion.
Vogelin is a much better writer. He's
a really good writer.
Have you read Vanderburg yet? Sorry, Tim. I'm turning this into a...
Yeah. No, you're good. Yes, I've read Vanderburg, and I've read John Ehrman, Hume's Abject Failure, and I've read the McGrews.
Somebody in the comments asked Ben, who's Ben's favorite critic of Hume? Tim McGrew, George Campbell, somebody else?
I think it was Price. I think Price is maybe Samuel Clarke. Samuel Clarke was pretty good. I thought they were. I'm just a really big fan of philosophers of that time period too. But so Price is the one that came up with lottery counterexamples, and so you weren't really able to adequately respond to that objection until the Bayesian calculus came out. I thought that was a really good objection, and there's a long-standing debate too that because Hume wrote Price a letter, saying he admired his response and that it might very well refute his way of thinking. I thought that was the strongest objection that was put forward, that was levied against Hume, and I thought I think it speaks highly of Hume's character that he was able to speak so sympathetically to him in his correspondence with Price.
Excellent. Well, for the audience, I would love to know who you agree with. So do you agree with David, or do you agree with Ben? And let us know in the comments where you think some of the holes were, where are some of the things that they might be missing, where you agreed, where you disagreed, and make sure you check out their content on their channel, the Real Anthology podcast for Benjamin and Christian Evidentialism with David. And guys, thank you so much for the great conversation. My head was working the whole entire time, so I know that's a great conversation. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Again, we are getting in the weeds. I love that. I love having these deep philosophical conversations. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it out. If you're interested in joining the Dealing with Deconstruction Facebook group, the link for that will be in the description of this video. And if you want to, you could go ahead and check out this video over here, or you could check out this video over here, or you could subscribe in the future. And that would be awesome to our YouTube channel. And with that, we will meet you next time as we deal with deconstruction.